Hinterkaifeck is not just a crime scene. It is a monument to a predator who lived inside the walls. In 1922, on a lonely Bavarian farm, 6 people were executed by a ghost who had already become part of their home. The horror began with footprints in the snow, leading from the dark forest directly to the house. There were no tracks leading back. The predator was already inside. For days, the family heard heavy footsteps in the attic. They found strange newspapers they never bought. Their house keys vanished. They were being watched through the cracks in the ceiling. The house was a trap. A narrow, dark corridor led the victims one by one into the barn. There, in the shadows, they were processed with clinical silence. After the murders, the killer did not leave. He stayed for days. He fed the cattle. He cooked in the kitchen. He slept in their beds while the bodies lay cold in the barn. The architecture of the farm protected the killer. It swallowed the screams and hid the blood. When the neighbors finally arrived, they found a living house inhabited by the dead. The mystery remains. How do you catch a shadow that has merged with the wood and stone of your own home? This is the architecture of doom, the living tomb. Why Hinterkaifeck is a monument to structural infiltration. The Hinterkaifeck massacre is not a simple cold case of mass murder. It is a profound demonstration of domestic predation within a closed system. In March 1922, a remote Bavarian farmhouse ceased to be a place of agricultural labor and transformed into a sovereign zone of occupation. This was not a crime of sudden impulse. It was the systematic infiltration of a family's private reality. The victims were observed and monitored by a predator that had integrated into the home's anatomy weeks before the terminal event. The premonition of the structural breach. The horror did not begin with the first blow. It began with the tactical indicators of a building that had been compromised. Hinterkaifeck was prepared for this slaughter with the cold precision of a clinical trial. The signal of entry. The discovery of human footprints leading from the dark forest directly into the farm's perimeter with no returning tracks was the first structural anomaly. The predator had successfully breached the outer membrane of the property and vanished into its internal volume. The acoustic witness, the heavy footsteps reported in the attic, the building's brain, were not ghosts. They were a record of tactical overwatch. The attic served as a vantage point for the intruder to study the family's movements, transforming the ceiling into a surgically thin barrier between the prey and the predator. The engineering of a sanctuary-turned trap. The brilliance of the Hinterkaifeck mystery lies in the total spatial manipulation experienced by the victims. While inside their own home, they were effectively trapped in a geographic void. The communication blackout. The farmhouse was situated in a state of environmental quarantine. Its distance from the nearest neighbor created a natural signal silence, ensuring that any scream would be absorbed by the dense Bavarian woods. The perimeter sabotage, the discovery of a strange newspaper, and the unexplained disappearance of the house keys were calculated security failures. The building's defenses were being dismantled from within, creating a state of engineered vulnerability. The mobility trap. The layout of the farm, connecting the living quarters to the barn via a narrow, dark corridor, created a surgical funnel. This architectural feature allowed the intruder to draw the victims out one by one, isolating them from the group. The biological absorption. For days after the murders, the architecture of the farm continued to breathe. The chimneys smoked, the cattle were fed, and the perpetrator slept in the victims' beds. This was the systematic erasure of the Gruber family. The predator had not just killed them, he had replaced them. By the time the bodies were discovered, the architecture of the cover-up was complete. The farm stood as a silent wooden monument to a tragedy engineered by its own walls. The acoustic siege, psychological erosion through structural resonance. The occupation of Hinterkaifeck was not merely a physical presence, it was a psychological dismantling executed through the building's own acoustics. Before the terminal phase, the farmhouse was repurposed into a resonance chamber. The intruder utilized the structure to conduct acoustic warfare, systematically eroding the victim's sense of security. The house was no longer a silent refuge. It became a transmitter of tactical dread. The mechanics of auditory dominance. The Hinterkaifeck structure acted as a natural amplifier for the predator's movements, creating a state of chronic sensory stress. 1. The ceiling as a speaker. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps heard from the attic were a form of structural intimidation. By moving directly above the family's living quarters, the intruder projected an unavoidable presence. This was a surgical strike on the subconscious. The family was forced to live in constant proximity to an invisible, overhead threat. 2. The shadow voices. Reports of unexplained whispers and muffled sounds within the walls indicate an extraction of privacy. The predator used the house's hollow voids and ventilation gaps to listen to the family's distress, using their own fear as a feedback loop to refine the timing of the infiltration. The engineering of structural gaslighting. The predator did not just remain hidden, he actively manipulated the environment to induce spatial disorientation. B. The artifact displacement. Keys that vanished and reappeared in illogical locations were indicators of invasive control. This was structural gaslighting, the process of making the victims doubt their own memory and the physical reality of their home. The boundary between safe and compromised was surgically erased. The attic vantage point. The attic served as the command and control center. From this elevated position, the intruder monitored the family's internal rhythms, when they ate, when they slept, and when they were most vulnerable. The house was effectively turned inside out. The interior was now a monitored cell, viewed from the dark voids of the ceiling. The silence of the perimeter. While the interior was loud with psychological noise, the exterior remained in a state of engineered silence. The farm's architecture, characterized by its thick walls and isolated location, ensured that the acoustic siege remained a private horror. No signal of the family's growing panic reached the outside world. The structure had successfully isolated its cargo for the final processing. By the end of March, the Gruber family was no longer a functioning unit. They were a collection of psychologically depleted subjects, trapped inside a building that had been weaponized against them. The perimeter breach, the systematic disabling of structural defenses, the transition from occupation to the terminal phase at Hinterkaifeck was marked by the surgical neutralization of the farm's perimeter. The intruder did not just inhabit the voids. He began to systematically disable the family's ability to interact with the outside world. The farmhouse was being converted from a residence into a hermetically sealed kill box. The mechanical deconstruction. The intruder began a process of access sabotage, ensuring the family remained physically locked within the predator's chosen environment. 1. The locksmith's anomaly. The discovery of deep, fresh scratches on the family's toolshed lock was a tactical indicator of tampering. The predator was not looking to steal. He was looking to override the access points. By testing and compromising the locks, he gained total environmental dominance over every structure on the property. The threshold erasure. The disappearance of the main house keys was the final stage of security extraction. By removing the family's primary means of securing their threshold, the intruder turned the home into an open entry system for himself, while it remained a cage for the victims. The door was no longer a barrier, it was an unstable boundary. The information quarantine. The predator ensured that the building remained in a state of spatial and informational isolation. The foreign artifact. The presence of a newspaper that the family never subscribed to was a signature of external presence. It was a clinical demonstration that the intruder was importing information into the farm while the family was trapped in a data void. The predator was the only link between the farmhouse and the outside world. The perimeter silence. The farm's geography was utilized as a natural silencer. The intruder recognized that the building's distance from the village created a signal dead zone. This environmental quarantine meant that the perimeter breach could happen in total silence, unnoticed by the surrounding civilization. The engineered blindness. As the terminal event approached, the family suffered from visual deprivation. The intruder's movements remained in the shadows and blind spots of the architecture. The family was looking for a threat outside, while the structural predator was already an integrated part of the interior volume. The perimeter was not just breached, it was annexed. The mechanical silence, the luring protocol, and structural funneling. As the terminal event approached, the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse transitioned from a state of occupation to a state of active processing. The predator began to utilize the building's internal layout to execute a surgical luring protocol. The house was no longer a living space. It was a mechanical trap designed to funnel biological units into a specific kill zone. Erasure. The structural funnel. The architectural connection between the living quarters and the barn was the primary tool used for sequential isolation. The barn as an abattoir. The barn was chosen as the terminal destination because of its acoustic and spatial properties. It was a large, hollow volume that could absorb the sounds of a struggle without alerting those still inside the house. The intruder utilized the barn as a functional void, a place where the extraction could be performed repeatedly and in total secrecy. 2. The narrow corridor. The narrow passageway connecting the house to the barn acted as a surgical funnel. By drawing the victims through this confined space, the predator ensured they could only move in one direction. This architectural feature prevented a collective escape and allowed for linear processing, taking the victims one by one. The engineered luring. The intruder triggered the family's sense of structural duty to draw them into the trap. The livestock disturbance. The predator likely manipulated the animals to create unexplained noise in the barn. This was a mechanical trigger, knowing the family would investigate any threat to their livestock. The house's dependency on its barn became its greatest tactical vulnerability. The sequential extraction. Each victim followed the previous one into the dark, drawn by the silence of those who had already been processed. The building's layout facilitated a delayed awareness. The family members remained unaware of the massacre occurring just meters away, separated only by the acoustic dampening of the barn's heavy timber walls. The terminal phase. The efficiency of the Hinterkaifeck event was a result of spatial dominance. The predator did not have to hunt his victims. He simply waited at the end of the funnel. The victims were delivered to him by the very architecture they trusted to protect them. The domestic labyrinth had reached its final state, a machine for the systematic erasure of a bloodline. By the time the last victim entered the barn, the architecture of the trap had functioned perfectly. The family was gone and the house was silent, ready for its new solitary inhabitant. The post-mortem occupation, the parasitic management of a dead home. The most disturbing phase of the Hinterkaifeck event was not the massacre itself, but the systematic colonization that followed. For several days, after the final extraction, the farmhouse remained a functioning biological unit. The predator did not flee the scene. He achieved total structural integration. The house, once a home for 6, became a parasitic shell where the killer lived among the remains of his victims in a state of clinical calm. The management of the corpse house. The intruder assumed the operational roles of the deceased family to maintain the appearance of a living farm. 1. The biological maintenance. In a display of perverse responsibility, the killer continued to feed the livestock. This was not an act of mercy, but a tactical preservation of the building's living status. By keeping the animals quiet, the predator ensured that neighbors would not investigate the farm due to the sounds of starving cattle. The farm's metabolism was kept alive by the very person who had stopped its heart. 2. The domestic consumption. Evidence showed that the intruder utilized the kitchen to prepare meals. He consumed the family's bread and meat, utilizing the house's resources to fuel his extended residency. This was a metabolic theft. The predator was literally sustained by the lifeblood of the victims he had just erased. The architecture of the cover-up. The building was used as a shield of invisibility to deceive the outside world. The chimney signal. By maintaining the fire in the hearth, the killer projected an illusion of occupancy to the surrounding village. Smoke rising from a chimney is a universal signal of life. The predator used this acoustic and visual camouflage to keep the perimeter of silence intact, delaying any discovery of the corpses lying in the barn. The living among the dead. The predator slept in the family's beds, while their bodies lay just meters away in the cold barn. This spatial coexistence suggests a total lack of psychological friction. The house had been successfully annexed. The killer was no longer an intruder, but the new solitary master of the Hinterkaifeck Labyrinth. The erasure of presence. During this period, the intruder had ample time for evidence management. The house provided the necessary concealment to clean or hide the tools of the extraction. The domestic labyrinth protected the killer, offering him warmth, food, and security, while the authorities remained unaware of the void he had created. By the time the predator finally exited the structure, he left behind a hollowed-out system, a building that looked like a home but functioned only as a tomb. The discovery anomaly, the breach of a living tomb. On April 4, 1922, the perimeter of silence surrounding Hinterkaifeck was finally breached. The discovery was not sparked by a scream, but by a functional breakdown. The family's failure to appear at church and the child's absence from school. When the search party arrived, they did not find a ransacked crime scene. They found a building in a state of stagnant animation. The house was physically intact, yet biologically dead, creating a profound architectural dissonance. The false pulse of the structure. The search party was initially deceived by the building's operational camouflage. 1. The illusion of life. As the neighbors approached, they observed smoke rising from the chimney and experienced the scent of recently cooked food. This was the signature of the predator, the remains of the intruder's post-mortem residency. The building was projecting a false pulse, suggesting that the family was simply busy with their daily routines, delaying the moment of discovery. 2. The guarded silence. The family's dog was found tied up, injured but alive. This was a strategic preservation by the intruder. By keeping the animal alive, the predator maintained the farm's auditory profile. A barking dog is a sign of a guarded home, not a graveyard. The dog had become an unwilling participant in the architecture of the cover-up, the breach of the kill zone. The search party's entry into the barn marked the transition from suspicion to structural horror. The stacked extraction. The victims were found in the barn, their bodies systematically stacked and covered with straw and an old door. This was spatial management of the dead. The predator had not left the bodies where they fell. He had organized them, clearing the kill zone to maintain its functionality. The barn had been treated as a warehouse for extracted units. The forensic impossibility. The scene was characterized by a clinical brutality. There was no evidence of a struggle outside the immediate kill zone. The victims had been delivered to their end by the house's own corridors. The architecture had facilitated a silent slaughter, allowing the intruder to process 6 individuals without a single one successfully breaching the perimeter to find help. The resident void. When the search party finally entered the living quarters, the horror deepened. They found evidence of recent inhabitation. The beds were warm, the food was fresh, and the intruder had only recently vacated the premises. The realization hit. The neighbors had been watching a living tomb for days, while the predator lived comfortably inside the domestic labyrinth. The house had protected the killer, concealing his presence until the very moment he chose to vanish back into the void. The forensic blind spot, clinical precision, and the anatomy of the strike. The discovery of the bodies at Hinterkaifeck revealed a surgical efficiency that transcended common violence. The examination of the remains provided a window into the predator's methodology, a process defined by anatomical dominance. The wounds were not the result of a chaotic struggle. They were the output of a systematic extraction protocol. The house had delivered the victims, and the predator had processed them with mechanical certainty, the instrument of extraction. The choice of weapon was a reflection of the farm's own mechanical landscape. One, the tool as a weapon. The weapon used was a mattock, a heavy, dual-purpose farming tool belonging to the estate. By using a tool already integrated into the farm's environment, the predator maintained weapon neutrality. He did not need to bring external hardware. He weaponized the farm's own inventory against its owners. 2. The single strike certainty. Each victim was neutralized with a high-velocity impact to the cranium. Forensic analysis showed that most victims were silenced instantly. This was tactical lethality. The predator knew exactly where to strike to prevent any vocalization that could compromise the acoustic shield of the barn. The clinical analysis of the wounds. The injuries provided a data set that suggested a professional familiarity with both the weapon and the biological limits of the subjects. The precision of the blows. The strikes were consistent and localized. This indicates a predator who was not acting in a state of emotional frenzy, but was performing a functional task. The narrowness of the corridor and the darkness of the barn did not hinder the accuracy of the strikes, suggesting the operator had practiced movements within the spatial constraints of the building. The youngest subject, the most chilling data point, was the treatment of the youngest victim, 2-year-old Joseph. He was extracted while sleeping in his crib within the house. This was the final perimeter breach. The predator moved from the work zone, the barn, into the safe zone, the nursery, to complete the total erasure of the bloodline. The strategic silence of the dead. The official autopsy conducted on the farm's own kitchen table highlighted a forensic void. Despite the brutality, there was a strange lack of defensive wounds on several victims. This confirms the structural surprise theory. The architecture had so successfully isolated the victims that they were processed before they could even identify the threat. The forensic blind spot was not just in the investigation, but in the victim's own perception. They were killed by a ghost that had become part of their home's anatomy. By the time the skulls were removed for further study in Munich, the predator's trail was already cold, swallowed by the same labyrinth that had facilitated the strike. The suspect profile, the ghost in the machine. The failure to identify the Hinterkaifeck predator was not due to a lack of suspects, but due to the architectural expertise required to execute the crime. The operator was not a random drifter. He was someone with a high spatial intelligence regarding the farm's unique layout. To live inside the walls of a functioning home for weeks without detection requires more than stealth. It requires a structural symbiosis with the environment. The profile of the interior operator. The suspect had to possess a specific set of technical and psychological competencies. 1. Spatial familiarity. The predator navigated the vertical labyrinth of the attic and the crawl spaces with absolute confidence. This suggests a previous occupation or a deep familiarity with the farm's construction. He knew which floorboards creaked and which doors could be opened silently. He was not a guest. He was an unauthorized resident. 2. Resource management. The intruder's ability to maintain the farm's biological functions, feeding cattle and managing the furnace, indicates a rural skill set. This was an operator who understood the metabolic rhythms of a Bavarian farm. He was a professional in the very field he was destroying. The candidate matrix. The investigation focused on individuals who occupied the shadow zone of the Gruber family's history. The return of the dead. One theory posits that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, officially killed in the trenches of WWI, had returned. This would explain the innate knowledge of the home. A soldier trained in trench warfare would find the attic of Hinterkaifeck to be a perfect sniper's nest for observation and a secure bunker for concealment. The neighboring rival. The proximity of neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer offered a different kind of tactical advantage. As a frequent visitor, he possessed authorized access to the perimeter. His involvement would explain the dog's lack of alarm and the ease with which the perimeter breach was initially ignored. The psychological ghosting. The suspect's most prominent trait was his emotional coldness. To eat, sleep, and perform chores, while 6 bodies lay stacked in the adjacent room, requires a state of psychological dissociation. The predator viewed the family not as humans, but as structural obstacles that needed to be removed to gain total control of the space. The investigation ultimately hit a data dead end. Because the perpetrator had become one with the architecture, he left no trace that could be distinguished from the farm's own natural decay. He was the ghost in the machine, an operator who understood that the best way to disappear is to become part of the structure itself. The decapitation anomaly, forensic desperation, and the psychic void. As the traditional investigation into the Hinterkaifeck massacre stalled, the authorities entered a phase of forensic desperation. The inability to track a predator who had effectively merged with the architecture led to one of the most bizarre and macabre chapters in criminal history, the post-mortem extraction of the victims' heads. This was a transition from physical science to metaphysical investigation, a clinical attempt to pull data from the dead when the building refused to yield the living. The surgical decapitation. The state's failure to secure a lead resulted in a secondary trauma to the victims' remains. 1. The extraction of the brain cases. The heads of all 6 victims were surgically removed and sent to Munich. The objective was to perform a cranial reconstruction to better understand the angle and force of the strikes. This was a surgical audit of the massacre, attempting to reverse engineer the predator's movements by analyzing the damage to the bone. 2. The loss of the physical record. In a catastrophic failure of evidence management, the skulls were lost during the chaos of the post-war period. This created a permanent data blackout. The most critical physical evidence of the strike patterns vanished, leaving only grainy photographs and handwritten notes. The victims were effectively erased twice, first by the predator, then by the bureaucracy, the occult intelligence. In the absence of forensic results, the authorities turned to anomalous intelligence in a last-ditch effort to break the silence of the farmhouse. The clairvoyant audit. The skulls were reportedly presented to clairvoyants in Munich. The state sanctioned a psychic reconstruction, hoping that the memory of the architecture and the event remained imprinted in the bone. This was a clinical retreat from logic, an admission that the Hinterkaifeck labyrinth was so complex that it required supernatural intervention to solve. The psychic blind spot. The seances yielded no actionable data. The ghost in the machine remained invisible even to those who claimed to see beyond the physical. The predator had achieved total informational stealth, leaving no psychic or physical footprint that could be tracked. The hollowed remains, the bodies, were eventually returned to the village and buried in a headless state. This biological incompleteness mirrored the investigation itself. The Hinterkaifeck case became a hollowed-out mystery, a structure with no roof, a body with no head, a crime with no perpetrator. The decision to decapitate the victims only served to deepen the structural void left by the massacre. The farmhouse had successfully protected its secret. Even when the victims' very bones were taken and scrutinized, the domestic labyrinth kept its hold on the truth. The predator had not just killed a family, he had paralyzed the entire legal and scientific apparatus of the state. The demolition of the labyrinth, the erasure of the physical evidence. The final stage of the Hinterkaifeck event was the surgical removal of the structure itself. In 1923, 1 year after the massacre, the survivors and the community decided to execute a total demolition of the farm. The building was not merely dismantled, it was erased from the landscape. This was a collective attempt to close the sovereign zone of disappearance and neutralize the predatory architecture that had facilitated the extraction of the Gruber bloodline. The deconstruction of the kill zone. The demolition revealed the hidden anatomy of the crime that the family had never seen. One, the discovery of the nest. As the roof was stripped away, workers found the predator's habitat. The attic contained evidence of a long-term residency. Indented straw where the intruder had slept, and food remains from the family's own larder. This was the final structural confirmation. The predator had lived as a parasite within the building's skull, watching the family through the floorboards until the moment of the strike. 2. The hidden inventory. The weapon, the iron mattock, was finally recovered during the demolition, hidden beneath the very boards where the victims had fallen. The house had been harboring the instrument of death long after the killer had vanished. The architecture had acted as a final accomplice, concealing the weapon in its wooden gut, the residual shadow. Even after the wood was burned and the stone foundations were scattered, the spatial trauma of Hinterkaifeck remained. The geographic scar, the land where the farm once stood, became a negative space. No new structure was ever built on the site. The community created a permanent quarantine, ensuring that the geometry of the trap could never be reconstructed. The farm was gone, but the atmospheric decay lingered in the soil. The informational void. With the building gone and the skulls lost in Munich, the case transitioned from a forensic reality to a pure mystery. The destruction of the Labyrinth ensured that no further spatial analysis could ever be conducted. The predator had achieved the ultimate goal of systematic erasure. Not a single trace of his identity survived the demolition. The conclusion of the architecture of doom, Hinterkaifeck remains the definitive study in environmental predation. It proves that a house is not just a shelter, but a complex machine that can be hijacked and turned against its inhabitants. The Gruber family did not die in a home. They died inside a domestic trap that had been surgically prepared for their end. The labyrinth is gone, but the lesson remains. The most dangerous threat is not the one outside your walls, but the one that has already become part of the structure.